Hello, good morning. All right, I know it's early and Law already took us to church, but I'm going to take it back. So when I say good morning, I need y'all to sound a little more excited. Good morning. Good morning. That's it. Y'all already fought through traffic. The hard part is over. You have made it. So I am so excited to be here with you today. I do not usually speak with notes, but I had to be here at 8 a.m. and I have toddlers, so y'all gonna get what you get. So when I first was approached about this topic of movement, as soon as Brandy told me what the topic was, I immediately knew what I wanted to talk about. And in case you can't see these pandemic pounds under this jumpsuit, I was not going to be talking about any movement in the gym. I knew as soon as I heard the phrase movement that I really wanted to talk about social movements. I wanted to talk about movement building and what it looks like to build movement in community around issues that you care about. Now, as Brandy mentioned, my name is Elsie Johnson. I'm the founder and CEO of Zora's House. We have a couple Zora's House members here this morning. Okay, all right. So if you're not very familiar, Zora's House is the only co-working space and leadership incubator in the state of Ohio that is created by and for women and gender expansive people of color. And Brandy already read our mission, so I'm not going to go deep into it, but the work that we do is really dedicated to dismantling the systemic barriers of racism and sexism and classism to ensure that women of color can fully contribute to the cultural life, the economic life, and the civic life of our community. Basically, we in here. And I want to make sure that women of color have that seat at the table that we're always talking about. Now, I'm actually really excited to talk about this concept of movements and movement building, because typically when I am telling the story of Zora's House, I do not get the opportunity to talk a lot about that part of the work. I don't always get the opportunity to talk about the framework and the philosophy that undergirds the work. But in addition to being an entrepreneur, I am also an activist. I'm an organizer. And so this idea of building social movements is really integral into the work of Zora's House, even though I oftentimes don't get a chance to talk about it the way that I would. So I'm going to turn it over to y'all real quick because I would love to hear from the audience. Is there anybody who can tell me like how they would define a social movement? I say the word social movement, like what would you say? How would you define it? I don't need Webster out here. I just need a couple words. Yeah. I love that. So Tracy said, people with the same mindsets gathering together to push forward their agenda or their cause. Anybody else have anything to add that they would want to add to that definition of a social movement? Yeah, Joel. What did you say? Educating folks. Karen? People using collective power. I love that phrase. To move around a topic, I'm going to go here and then here. Justice? Yes. Organic. Yeah, and I'll take one more. Starting conversations that haven't been started yet. Yes, I love all of these definitions. So the definition that I really love, one of the simplest definitions of social movements that I've come across is building people power towards a collective and transformative social goal, right? So building people power towards a collective goal that is also a transformative social goal. Now, most people probably have some examples or can think of a few examples of historical movements, right? So you might say the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the women's suffrage movement. There's a theme here. It usually has movement at the end, so they're not exactly hidden in our history books. But these are the type of things that people think about and talk about when they say, you know, we're starting this movement or this movement exists. So then what gives me the audacity to call a little co-working space in the Wyland Park neighborhood of Columbus, Ohio, a movement, right? And actually, in the beginning, I didn't call it that. And that's the end of my notes. So from here on out, we just winging it. I'm about to put this phone down and we'll see what happens. So in the very beginning of founding Zora's House, I didn't call it a movement. And I had to be given some different clues to help me understand even the depth and the breadth of the work that we were trying to do. So I mentioned to y'all this two-part definition. And the first part of that definition is building people power, right? Building people power. But when I founded Zora's House, I didn't necessarily found it with the idea that I was building people power. Many of you who have heard the story of Zora's House know that I moved here in 2015. And I did not know anybody but my husband and my in-laws, whose basement we were living in. Very glamorous time had by all. And I was in a period of transition. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. We were thinking about having kids. I was recently married. And one thing that had always been really true for me at every point of transition in my life had been the importance of being surrounded by other Black women and other women of color, being witnessed by Black women, being encouraged by Black women, being wrapped up, laughing with Black women. That had always been such a central part of my experience in the most successful transitions in my life. And so when I moved to Columbus, I started to search for that type of community. I wanted to find a community where I could get connected, where I could be supported, where I could think through what was next for me. And I really struggled to find it. And so, a few months after moving here, I went to bed and I had this dream. I had this dream that I was in this really amazing space and all these dope women were there and Lauryn Hill was playing on the speakers and people were sending emails. And I woke up and I was like, yo, that space, that has to exist. That space has to exist in the world. And it was at the time, my inspiration really came from the fact that I had moved here from North Carolina, where I had been an early employee at a startup co-working space for social entrepreneurs. And before that job, I had never heard of co-working. I barely even understood what entrepreneurship was. And so that being a part of starting that co-working space and community was really transformative for me. And so when I had this idea of this space where people were coming together and they were getting work done and they were building, thinking and connecting with each other, I was just like, okay, co-working space, because it was the model that I had seen previously. And so in 2018, we opened up a co-working space. But very early on, we found that the women of color who would come to the space and would talk about how transformative the space was, did not think the word co-working really resonated. They were like, co-working, I don't know, that's not really for me, right? But then they would come to our space and they would connect and they would feel like this weight had been lifted off their shoulders and that they could be very authentic and they can make new friends. And it was really interesting to me because one of the first ways that we measured it was okay, so people love this space. They love connecting with each other. But what we saw was in the early days, people would come, they would make these connections, they would have friends, they would attend events, and then they started to kind of drop off from coming to the actual space. We're just like, what are we doing wrong? What's going on? People seem to love it here. And so we reached out to some of our community members and we said, hey, we noticed you haven't been in the space. Did we do something? Is it that it's not valuable to you? Do you not want to be a member of Zora's House anymore? And they were like, no. I'd never get rid of my membership to Zora's House. And I was like, you never come to the space. Why would you want to keep your membership? And it became very clear to me in those conversations that we were thinking that we were building space with community as an add-on. But in fact, what people were telling us was that we were building community with space as an add-on, right? And that what people were really resonating with was this community that they found when they were at Zora's House, this ability that they found to step into a space that had been created with them in mind. And for all of the women of color in the room, many of us recognize what a gift it is to enter into a public space that has been created with us in mind. That is actually incredibly rare, right? So most spaces historically have been created for white men or white people. And so to come into a public space and say, oh, this is my space, Like, it's not retrofitted for me. Y'all built this for me, right? It allows for those folks to say, you know what, I can be all of who I am in this moment and in this space. And so without knowing it, we started to build people power. We started to build people power, that desire for folks to say, I'm a part of something bigger. And it's not about these four walls, but I'm a part of something bigger, right? But then we get to the second part of our definition about building social movements, right? So part of it is this idea of building people power, bringing people together around a shared identity, a shared mission. But then there's that piece, to what end, right? Like, why are you bringing them together? It's all good to bring people together and just have a good time. We do that too. There is a lot of wine consumed at Zora's house, if we're going to be honest about the situation, right? It's all good to bring people together and have a good time, but to what end, right? What is the transformative social goal that we have in place? And again, this was something that came rather organically as Zora's house started to build and expand. When we first started Zora's house, I mentioned that like it really came from my own desire for community. And I knew, just because I'm a women's studies major, I had been in that space, that like that feeling of isolation and loneliness was not just a personal feeling, right? That like there are many cities that are not really built to uplift and connect people of color in community. So I knew already that it wasn't just me. It wasn't just a me thing, that there was a wider issue that my experience was reflecting back to me. But I don't think at the moment that I had put it together and said, okay, I'm going to build Zora's house, I'm going to build this movement, and I'm going to change everything from the ground up. But what ended up happening was, I started going out and talking to funders. So I would go out and I'd have conversations and I'd be like, hey, I'm starting this co-working space for women of color. This is what we do. We're trying to ensure that women of color entrepreneurs and leaders and professionals have the resources that they need to really contribute and thrive in our community. And they'd listen. They'd be like, oh, yeah, I love that. I love that. And they'd say, I have some partnership suggestions for you. I'm new to Columbus, got a little pen out. I'm like, okay, family, go ahead. Tell me, who should I work with? And they'd say, oh, you should connect with some of the partners that we work with. We fund things related to women of color too. So you should connect with some of our partners. I was like, okay, who? And they'd be like, well, the homeless shelter, the food pantry, the poverty center. And it became very clear early on that when I said women of color, that for many people in power in our community, they heard low-income women. And that the idea of women of color was very synonymous with them. Even though, hello, I'm literally standing right here. But this idea of women of color not being a monolith and existing across a spectrum of identity and experience, whether it's gender identity, whether it's class identity, whether it's educational experience, that we exist across this entire wide, broad spectrum. And what's really interesting is when I come to a community and I look around and I see every initiative that is about, quote unquote, supporting women of color, or touching women of color, and it has to do with, keeping people's lights on and keeping food on the table and this and that. I understand that those programs are extremely important. Women of color over-index in a lot of social issues, not because of who we are, but because of racism, because of sexism. But even still, when I see a community say, oh yeah, we're doing stuff for women of color, and all they can tell me is, we want to make sure that folks have a roof over their head, I'm like, I think we deserve more. I think we deserve more than just a roof over our head and food in our stomachs, right? Like, that's the bare fucking minimum. Like, y'all tripping. It's 2023, okay? We passed that. Like, that's the bare minimum. I'm talking about how do we ensure that women of color, have a voice, are able to lead, have the resources they need to drive change, right? And I remember actually in last November, we're in the process of building a whole new space, which is a whole other talk, and I don't want to talk about it because it's stressful. So that's a whole other talk. I don't know if they have creative happy hours, but we can do that time. So we were having an event in November that we had an event in August that was all for women of color to kind of announce this capital campaign and this new amazing space that we're trying to build that is meant to be a center of innovation, entrepreneurship, and economic empowerment for women of color. And we had this amazing event with like women of color, and everybody was so excited about it. But then we wanted to also make sure that we had an event for allies, for our non-women of color who also are very supportive of our work. So in November, we had this event that was specifically for allies. And I laughed because one of my friends who was there, who is an ally, was like, wait, so you're telling me like you gathered the women of color and y'all had like a candle lit dinner party with like wine and music, and then you brought the allies together and gave us some Costco pastries in like the lobby of your building? I was like, yeah, that's right. But as we were kind of talking to some of the folks in the room, the like more powerful folks in the room, and we were talking about the mission of Zora's House, and I was like, when we think about women of color and we say, hey, we want to make sure these folks have food and water and shelter, I was like, when I think about Zora's House, I don't want to stop until the women of color in our community have your job. I want them to run your bank. I want them to be the CEO of your foundation, right? So I want you to feel threatened by the work that we're doing. I mean, keep funding it, because appreciate y'all. But I want you to feel threatened by the work that we're doing, because this idea that giving folks just enough is just enough doesn't work in our community or any other community. And so as I started to have these conversations, and we started to talk not just to funders, but even for the women of color themselves, and started talking about like, how do we transform our ideas of what we deserve? It was really interesting last night. Tasha was there. We have a program called the Leadership Fellows Program. And we were sitting around and kind of just folks were reflecting on like what they've gotten out of the Leadership Fellows Program. And, they were talking about like, they've gotten friendships and mentors and connections and confidence. But one of the things that was so powerful that somebody said that has been reflected time and time again by folks who have come through Zora's House is that Zora's House teaches you how the rest of the world should treat you. You come into Zora's House and you have an experience of being validated for your ideas. You have an experience of being lifted up and somebody saying, yeah, girl, you got this, right? And that Zora's House has become this training ground for women of color to come in and practice who they want to be in every space they enter, whether it's welcoming to them or not. Because that type of courage takes practice. It takes space. It takes community. And so slowly but surely, we started bringing the people together. And slowly but surely, as we started having conversations and realizing that our work isn't just about serving individual people, it's about transforming our understanding of how we think of women of color in our community. It's about ensuring that we see women of color for the full spectrum of their experiences and their leadership and their contributions. It's about ensuring that women of color themselves, who have grown up with these messages of not enough, of too dark, of too nappy, of too loud, can come into a space and say, actually, sis, girl, you fine and you smart. And that they can start to transform how they show up in different spaces. And so it was really interesting when I was talking to my husband last night. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm really stressed out because I have to do this talk about movement. And I was like, I totally get it, but like, I just got to figure out how I want to frame this. And I want to talk about Zora's House as a movement. And he, in all seriousness, like no shade at all, was like, I would not, he was like, the way I define social movements, like, I don't know that I would define like Zora's House as a movement. What makes you define it as that? And so that question, just so calmly asked, was the inspiration for me to understand and articulate today, like how I have the audacity to call a little co-working space in the Wyland Park neighborhood of Columbus, Ohio, a movement. Thank you so much. 19 seconds to go.